Okay, picking up right where we left off. Here we go, 2000. All right, so he served out his 2 terms, and the 2000 election comes up now, and his vice president is this man. His name is Al Gore, and Gore's going to run basically on the same platform as Clinton, but yet without these scandals of the personal problems. He was more of a Boy Scout. His father had been a famous senator from Tennessee, so he's Southern, and so Southerners tend to get Southern votes and this kind of stuff. And then, of course, on the left, we see George W. Bush. So he's a Texan. So we have 2 Southerners running here, and the 2000 election is going to take off, and it was very, very evenly distributed between the guys. It was a tough one to call who was going to win this. George W. Bush was very engaging, and he had sort of that Texas charm going on. Al Gore was very liberal, and especially when it came to environmental issues. He wanted to regulate, our lives so that we couldn't use as many, cars and things like this. So that was sort of something that turned off the conservatives. But Bush was this Christian, and I don't know. They called him a cowboy. They said he was a cowboy. Most people tried to make that he was not very smart. But he was a graduate of Yale, and so don't worry, he was plenty smart. You got to be smart to get this far. He had been governor of Texas. All right, so it all came down in the election to the state of Florida, and what I'm showing you right here is their ballot. Now, y'all haven't voted yet. Someday you will, and typically when we vote here in this area, we have a page that looks a little bit like a test with little bubbles you fill in with a pencil. Okay, so just like a test that gets filled in ABC kind of a thing. And so if I were voting for here George W. Bush, I would color in that circle. But here they have something where you punch a little stylus down through a hole, and there's a card that he would just put up in there, and that card has these little punches on them, and you punch it out. So if the little hole is punched there, that means you voted for him. You can feed that into a computer. The computer counts where the punches are gone, and then that's how they count the vote. Notice how many people were on the ballot. I don't even remember this. We had George W. Bush and his vice president Dick Cheney. We had Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. So those are the main ones. But look, we have a libertarian candidate, a green candidate, I do remember him, a socialist workers candidate, something called the natural law candidate, the reform candidate. I do know Pat Buchanan. I forgot that he had run on this particular year. A socialist, not socialist workers, but socialist candidate, a constitution candidate, don't know anything about that, and workers' world, probably communist candidate right there. And so you see how that arrow is pointing to that. But this is called the butterfly ballot, and it was kind of confusing. Somebody may have thought that this was where they were supposed to be punching for Al Gore. Right there, you see. But that was actually for the other side. Right there. Okay. And we have this thing right here where this is the punch card. Look kind of like this. You'll see a picture of a real one here in a second. But sometimes when it got punched, it didn't punch the whole piece out. And so this thing was called the hanging door Chad. This was called the swinging door Chad. This was called the tri-Chad, not exactly sure why. This was called the dimpled Chad. Maybe somebody started to push and stopped. This one somebody maybe didn't push hard enough. And so what happened was that they decided they had to do a hand recount, and instead of the computer they're looking at these ballots. So you see the ballot looks like this. It's got all those little holes punched in it. And this guy's looking just at the one for president, and he's saying which one is punched. Is it punched all the way through? Is it completely, is the hole completely, clear? Is it a hanging Chad? Is it a dimpled Chad? Is it this kind of stuff? And so what happened was that the state of Florida started counting only in the precincts where the most liberal people in Florida live. And George W. Bush, oh wow, that was thunder. George W. Bush appealed to the Supreme Court and said it was unfair that if they're going to do a recount in Florida, they had to recount all of the counties, not just the 4 populated ones that have a lot of Democrats living in them. And he ended up winning that argument in front of the Supreme Court. It was an emergency Supreme Court case that was taken. He won that. They did have to stop the Florida count. And I will tell you later on, they did finish the count, officially later, and they did find out that George W. Bush did indeed win the state of Florida. So some people complained about that they stopped it before they could find out that Al Gore really had won it. And it really did come down to that one state. That's 25 electoral votes right there. Look how slim this was. 271 to 266. You see how 25 was important? It could have gone either way. And because Florida went to Bush in the end, Bush won the 2000 election. Now the popular vote, take a look at this. Al Gore got 48.4% of the popular vote, and Bush only got 47.9% of the popular vote. So who got more of the popular vote? Al Gore. But who won the Electoral College? George W. Bush. And that's why he became president number 43. There was a long time before it was called, though. You know, typically you have an election and you know by the next day, maybe 2 days later. But in this particular case, we had to wait a month or two before we knew that Bush was the president. I remember it very well. I was a big fan of George W. Bush because I'm a Texan, and I just like him. I still like him, even though he's not my favorite president ever. I just liked him personally. I believe he's a brother in Christ and this kind of thing. So I remember the night waiting up to hear him give his acceptance speech, and he never came out. I remember he was in Austin, and it was raining, and we waited till 3 o'clock in the morning, and he never came out. And then we had to wait and wait and wait until it finally was called, and he became our 43rd president. All right, very soon. So he was inaugurated in January, and it was September when this horrible incident took place. All right, so this is 2001. You can ask your parents. They will remember where they were that day. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember very clearly. It was very early in the morning, about 8 a.m., when we heard the news that an airplane had hit the World Trade Center. Of course, at the very beginning, we thought it was an accident, that an airplane had, crashed into the World Trade Center. And then 20 minutes later, a second airplane crashed into the second tower. And that's when we knew that we were under attack. And it was a very fearful time in America. Let's watch a little something about it.
September 11th, 2001. A day of grief. A day of courage. This is how that day unfolded.
My daughter called me. She said, plane just flew into the World Trade Center. I said, nah, you gotta be kidding. It's gotta be a Piper Cub or some clown was flying down the river.
At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston, with 92 aboard, traveling at a speed of 470 miles per hour, strikes the North Tower of the World Trade Center complex. Within minutes, officials coordinate the citywide emergency response. Their base of operations is a state-of-the-art command center located on the 23rd floor of 7 World Trade Center. With one tower in flames, the tragedy is only beginning. It is 9:03 when United Airlines Flight 175, with 65 aboard, traveling at the speed of 590 miles per hour, smashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. This aircraft strikes the corner of the South Tower. It rips a diagonally shaped gash from the 84th to the 78th floors. The South Tower lasts only 56 minutes before it succumbs at 9:59 a.m. A dust cloud billows outward for blocks. Victims stagger away. At 10:28, the television mast atop the North Tower spears straight down.
Once the collapse started, there really wasn't any way to stop it. It was just going to go all the way down once it got started.
Chaos in New York City. Power is down in Lower Manhattan. Phone lines jammed with more than 230 million calls. Hundreds of firefighters trapped in the towers. Hundreds more race to the scene. Falling debris from the collapse of the north and south towers ignites fires in the neighboring buildings of the World Trade Center. World Trade 4, 5, and 6 are ablaze. World Trade 7, the building housing the city's command center, burns unchecked for 7 hours. At 5:20, it collapses. The city's emergency nerve center is destroyed.
Somewhere in that time, and it's very hard to keep track of time during this, they had been ordered to evacuate number 7 by the Port Authority. To this day, we don't know who gave that order, but whoever it was saved a lot of people's lives.
With New York a war zone, some residents walk across the Brooklyn Bridge to get out of the city. Others seek escape in vessels piloted by the Army Corps of Engineers. At 7:45 p.m., the New York Police Department says 78 officers are missing and estimates that 200 firefighters are dead. At 10:56 p.m., police officials say they believe there are victims alive in the rubble of the World Trade Center.
Working with urban search and rescue teams, there was a lot of areas to be searched underneath the debris field. There were voids that had to be searched for possible live people.
September 11th, 2001, the longest and most tragic day in New York's history, is drawing to a close.
So President Bush was in Florida at the time. He was actually in a school group. He was sitting with some school children. I think they were kindergartners. He was reading a book to them. And this is one of his aides coming to whisper in his ear what has just happened. And so many people criticized Bush for sitting there and not, jumping up and getting out. But his main concern, of course, he knew there was a big problem. He didn't want to scare the children. And so he sat there for a few minutes and he said, well, I've got to go. It's, bye, kids. And then he got on his plane and he was whisked away somewhere. We didn't even know where he was because people were afraid that he was, a target as well. Furthermore, there were other planes in the sky that were unaccounted for. 2 more planes unaccounted for. Let's see.
One report said, and we can't confirm any of this, that a plane may have hit one of the 2 towers of the World Trade Center.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Our belief at the moment is that an aircraft has crashed into the Pentagon.
By 9:34 a.m., it had become clear to air controllers that yet another plane had been hijacked. Then word started reaching the press.
Across the scanner in our newsroom was said that there was a flight that was missing. There had been a flight that they thought was heading towards Pittsburgh or Johnstown, which is where I was, and they couldn't get in touch with it.
They were talking about Flight 93. It had changed direction and was apparently now over Pennsylvania. All indications were that the plane was heading towards the nation's capital. But the hijackers had been careful to turn off the transponder, cutting all communication with air traffic control. From a plane near Cleveland, a call came into the GTE phone center. It was particularly alarming.
When I took over the call, there was a gentleman on the line, very soft-spoken, calm.
The soft-spoken gentleman was Todd Beamer, a passenger on United 93.
I asked him to explain to me in detail what is happening on the plane. He told me there were 3 people that was taking over the flight.
They tied red bandanas around their head, got up, and that was when they forced their way into the cabin.
But when the hijackers stormed the cockpit, nobody on Flight 93 was primed to stop them.
Prior to September 11th, the way flight attendants were trained on a plane was to listen to the hijackers, to stay calm, and to to comply with what their demands were.
Unreleased recordings indicate a struggle in the cockpit.
In the cockpit, I think that what happened is the pilots had been subdued. I think their necks had been slashed, and they're strapped in. They've got no way of defending themselves. You can't turn around and fight. They're just sitting ducks.
But it only got worse. From the hijackers, there was a horrifying announcement.
The hijackers on the intercom saying, "There's a bomb on board. We have control of this plane. We're going back to the airport."
On the airphone, Todd Beamer had informed operator Lisa Jefferson about the hijackers' tactics.
He told me that they've taken control of the plane. The plane is going down. At this point, he raised his voice. He said, "We're going down. We're going down. No, we're coming back up. Wait, we're turning around. We're going back north. I think we're going north." At this point, I don't know where we're going.
In fact, they had turned around and were now going east. At 9:35, it appeared that the hijackers were headed for Washington, D.C. But this was no ordinary hijacking. The attack on the World Trade Center would soon become known to the passengers on Flight 93, who called relatives.
And that's when they knew that this plane wasn't just being flown back to an airport. Once those people on board that plane knew it, they knew there was no going back. I mean, this was the new reality of what we face now, and they were the first ones that realized they needed to do something.
In the air above Pennsylvania, a plot was brewing.
Ty told me that him and a few other guys were thinking about jumping the guy with the bomb. He felt that he had to do to try to save the plane, at least try to get the plane to land safely. And I told him that he had every hope, and I had hope for him that they could land the plane safely. He turned from me to speak to someone else, and he said, "Are you ready?" I couldn't hear their response. He said, "Okay, let's roll." That's the last I heard from Todd Beamer. The line was still open, but it was very silent. I didn't hear anything else. I kept that phone line open for about 15 additional minutes. And while our operations center was tracking the call, we heard that the plane had crashed in Pittsburgh. And I knew that was his flight. I felt that I had just lost a good friend.
A 35-foot deep pit in Pennsylvania became the grave of everybody on Flight 93.
People were drawn to Flight 93 because they felt those people on board were the first warriors in the battle against terrorism. And that's a theme you see in this temporary memorial over and over again in the messages people leave. Thank you for fighting back. Thank you for starting this fight against terrorists. I think people have thought that through and thought, would I do that? These people did something special.
All right, so that was the third plane, but there was a fourth plane. All right, and I can't remember which order it went in. I thought that we heard about the Pentagon plane last.
I was a reporter for the Washington Post. My assignment was covering the Pentagon as an installation, a large military installation in the Washington region. We have just been attacked in an act of war. This is the military's command center. And the Pentagon, when it was built, there was criticism at the time that what the military was creating was the world's largest bombing target. You can't really get a grasp for how big the Pentagon is until you see it from the air. The Pentagon, in a way, is 5 separate buildings that are built next to each other. It's these 5 wedges. You also have 5 rings that divide it up further. By any measure, it's the biggest office building in the world. A building with 17 miles of corridors, a 35-acre roof. A building where 20,000 people would go to work every morning. You have a building that needs to swing into action to start dealing with this new war. As a reporter, your instinct is to go to the scene. And as I got closer, there was this enormous black plume. In the middle of this beautiful blue sky morning in Washington, you had this ugly plume of black smoke.
From where I was standing, you could see these Navy personnel who had come to help pull people out of the damaged area, which was the Navy Command Center. You could see the water between ankle and half calf deep. It wasn't occurring to me, it was jet fuel.
The plane struck the building right at about a 40-degree angle. The wings pretty much disintegrated upon impact, but the fuselage blew open a hole in the wall, in the limestone facade of the Pentagon, and the rest of the aircraft followed in and continued all the way through the E-ring, the D-ring, the C-ring.
When a plane came through, if you can imagine, a room full of partition furniture, and you have this force coming through there, it's taking all of that furniture and people and everything. This hole were popped out. It was kind of into that area where everything had been shoved into. Yeah.
I left the building through what's called the mall entrance, and the first thing you could see obviously is smoke and flame. And as I get closer and closer, I see bits and pieces of something littering the grass, the field. And the first thing that was recognizable was a big piece of the fuselage. It was white with a big red A on it, American Airlines. And then I came around the outbuilding, and then it was like a dream sequence, because there before me were some either dead or gravely injured people laying on the ground.
All right, so the Pentagon got hit as well that day. So here's George Bush, only 8 months president, and he is in New York City standing on top of the rubble. When those buildings came crumbling down, we were shocked. We had no idea the buildings would do something like that. Being hit by a plane was one thing, and then the whole things came down. As you know, people in the buildings were killed. People on the planes were killed, and then people when the buildings came down were killed. And some of the people who couldn't get out jumped off. It was just horrible. The whole thing was horrible. And several days later, we have the president standing on top of the rubble, and he's speaking out to the people who are gathered there, mostly first responders, and things like that. Some people coming to look for their loved ones who hadn't heard from them and this kind of thing. And the famous quote here was George W. Bush said that the people, he's speaking in the little megaphone thing there, and the people out there said, "We can't hear you." And he answered back, "You may not hear me, but I can hear you. And the whole world will hear us soon." And so he promised to do something about it. This is one of the most iconic pictures. These guys found a flag somewhere in the area, and they put it up. So these firemen decided to put that flag up in the midst of that destruction that took place. I will say all of the dust and everything in the air wreaked havoc on these guys for years. Some of them ended up with lung cancer and other horrible, debilitating diseases just from helping to clean up the rubble out there. We, of course, got all cleaned up eventually, and now instead of the 2 towers, we have 1 tower. And then we have 2 where the footprints were, so that would be the holes where the basements were of these buildings. Those had been turned into reflecting pools, I think. I've not been up there, but it's sort of a tribute. And then a new building built elsewhere close by to be the World Trade Center now. Okay, so obviously the very worst attack on our country. It was even worse than Pearl Harbor. All right, I want to finish the year with this guy. He's an Australian guy who's going to talk about American greatness.
G'day there. As an outsider, I have a unique perspective from which to view America. As an American friend said to me, sometimes it takes someone on the outside to remind us what we're like on the inside. I'm an Australian, you might have already guessed that, and I love my home country, and I am proud that my nation has long been a reliable American ally. But I know that Australia is not America, and that my country has not achieved what America has achieved. No country in human history has. What makes America different? There are many answers, but start with one you might not have thought of. Most people think America is all about success. I see it a little differently. I think America is all about failing. Most people in the world don't get the chance to fail, but Americans take it for granted. Only Americans say, if at first you don't succeed, try again. There's even an academic study to prove this. According to a study by Harvard Business School professor Stephen Rogers, most entrepreneurs fail 4 times before they succeed. Success takes timing and hard work, some good luck, many other factors. But to succeed, you must be given the chance to fail, and you must accept responsibility if you do. I love that about Americans. At their best, they don't blame others. They learn from their mistakes and do better the next time. And in America, there's almost always a next time. Nowhere else are you as free to take entrepreneurial risks. Talk to someone who has tried to start a small business in Germany or Brazil, and you'll see what I mean. From the outside looking in, I can only admire this. And I'm not the only one. Just take a look at the CEOs of major Silicon Valley companies. You will see the names of entrepreneurs from all over the world. India, Pakistan, Russia, Israel, you name the country. Why did they come to America to innovate? Because there's a lot of money here? Yes, of course, that's part of it. But there's a lot of money in London and Berlin and Tokyo as well. They came to America because America gave them the chance to fail, and therefore the best chance in the world to succeed. And the rest of the world can thank their lucky stars for America's economic success. Not only is America by far the world's largest economy, it is also the world's largest consumer. And the world's economy depends on being able to sell to America. It would also be perfectly natural for Americans to want to keep all this wealth to themselves, but they don't. Just the opposite, in fact. America has been the most selfless nation in the history of the world. Yet another way in which America is different. What other nation fights for the freedom of others? In Europe, in 2 world wars, in Korea, in Vietnam, and yes, in Iraq. In all those wars, America had very little or nothing to gain economically. Whenever there is a humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, Haiti after a hurricane, Indonesia after a tsunami, who is the first to rush aid to these places? No matter where the calamity is, at home or abroad, Americans invariably raise millions of dollars almost instantly to send food and clothing and supplies to people in distress they don't know and will never meet. Who else does that? I love that America is different. What worries me about America is that I see her increasingly trying to act like other nations. It worries me to see that so many Americans are drawn to the ossified ideas of Europe. That's the old world. It was old in 1776 even, when America broke away from it. Why would America want to reverse its own revolution? Why would Americans want to follow the economic and social model of a continent that they can see is failing economically and socially? Do Americans really want to emulate France or Greece? It worries me to see so many Americans wallowing in victim status, blaming outside forces for their predicament, rather than accepting responsibility and seeking to improve themselves. It worries me to see American schools debasing America's own glorious history. It worries me to see America's debt and government grow larger while its military and its personal freedoms shrink. It worries me because a weak, self-doubting America is bad for everyone, everywhere, who loves freedom. But these worries never last long, because each time I visit America, I encounter a people who are confident, competitive, courageous, faithful, idealistic, innovative, inspirational, charitable, and optimistic. It's like no other place in the world. I pray it stays that way. I'm Nick Adams for Prager University.
Okay, so I just wanted to leave you with the idea that America is a place to be proud of. Okay, he mentioned in there that it was a shame that schools were teaching, not teaching the glories of America. Well, obviously I'm not that. I'll tell you about the bad things. Sure, we have to own up to that kind of thing. But in the end, we know that our Constitution is it's a glorious thing. All right, it's not the Bible, okay, and this is not the only place that God loves, but it is freedom is the center point of that, and it's worth fighting for. And so we don't have to run America down. We can remember how great America is. And I love the way he put it so succinctly about our optimism and our generosity. And I believe all of that's true. Okay, gang. Well, it's been great having you this year as my American history students. And I'll see you next week when we do our projects. Okay, everybody? Appreciate it. Appreciate y'all. Have a great, great summer.